Hello and welcome to this first Constitution Unit online event of 2022, entitled What Can Be Done About the House of Lords. I'm Meg Russell and I'm the Director of the Constitution Unit, and I'm going to be chairing today's session. As some of you will be aware, I've now been writing about the House of Lords and possibilities for reform of the House of Lords for, I'm sad to say, over 20 years. But 20 years is just a small fraction of the amount of time for which House of Lords reform has been almost constantly on the political agenda. We talk about it a lot, but very little ever changes. The House of Lords is a naturally controversial institution for various reasons, due to its unelected membership, and also the role that it has, questioning the House of Commons and questioning the government. Though polling actually shows in some ways that members of the public appreciate the House of Lords more than they do at times the House of Commons. So it's a conundrum as an institution. There's very widespread agreement that the House is much too big. And this year, 5 years ago, there was a report published by a committee set up by the Lord Speaker looking into the size of the House to suggest how to get its size down. And yet under this Prime Minister, its size has continued to grow, and we're at around 800 members. Boris Johnson is also the first Prime Minister to have openly flouted recommendations on the propriety of appointments from the House of Lords Appointments Commission. And just a few months ago, we had a new round of controversy in a story, I think, in the Sunday Times about cash for peerages, allegations of cash for peerages. Finally, despite repeated attempts by Lord Grocott, most recently, who's just kicked off his attempt again, it hasn't even seemed possible to remove the remaining hereditary peers from the House of Lords, despite there being quite widespread agreement that that should happen. They were left there as a temporary measure, supposedly, when Labour reformed the House more than 20 years ago. Hence our question for this evening: what can be done about the House of Lords? And indeed, what should be done and how might it be done? We've got a fantastic panel with us this evening. Angela Smith, Baroness Smith of Basildon, who seems to have momentarily disappeared, is Labour's shadow leader of the House of Lords and has been since 2015. She's been a member of the House since 2010. And before that was the MP for Basildon. And I'm sorry if Angela can't hear me say this, that I'm rather amazed to think that this year she will be celebrating 25 years in Parliament, as she was elected in 1997. Michael Jay, Lord Jay of Uelm, has been a crossbench peer since 2006, following a distinguished career in the diplomatic service. He is, crucially for this event, a former chair of the House of Lords Appointments Commission. I believe, Michael, 2008 to 2013.
That's right.
And finally, last but not least, Sir Bernard Jenkin is the Conservative MP for Harwich and North Essex. And before you chastise me, Bernard, I'm aware that you've spent an amazing 30 years in the House of Commons this year, first elected
I can't quite believe
in
it myself.
1992. Bernard is the former chair of the House of Commons Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, which crucially issued a report 2 or 3 years ago on what we should do with the House of Lords, which I was delighted to be the specialist advisor for. He no longer chairs that committee. He has been elevated to chair the liaison committee of the House of Commons, which is the committee made up of all of the select committee chairs, which amongst other things questions the Prime Minister. So we are honoured and delighted to have you, Bernard, here along with Baroness Smith and Lord Jay. And Angela, I think we lost you for a bit there. I just mentioned that I think this year marks your 25th year in Parliament, which is pretty amazing. And Bernard's
I've just actually been re-elected today for my 5th term as leader of the Labour group in the House of Lords.
Congratulations.
Can you hear me? I had to switch machines. I'm sorry, I've had to change machines that I was speaking to you on. Blame House of Lords Wi-Fi.
That's fine. We're pleased to have you back. So the format for this evening's event is each panelist will speak for just around 5 minutes to open, starting with Angela, then Michael, and then Bernard. We will then have a discussion amongst us as a panel for maybe sort of 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll open up to questions from you, the audience. If you want to ask a question to the panel, think about that and pop it in early. Write it in the Q&A function rather than the chat function of Zoom, and Lisa is here to facilitate our Q&A. She will gather up questions that have been posted, and we'll ask them in groups, inviting the person who asked the question to ask their own question by unmuting themselves and asking it directly to the panel. But if you don't want to do that, you can specify that you want Lisa to ask your question, and you can also ask it anonymously if you prefer. This whole session, including the Q&A part, is being recorded, and it will be posted online on the Constitution Unit YouTube channel, and it will go out as a Constitution Unit podcast after the event. We'll let you all know when the recording's available, and we hope you'll want to share it with others. Now, that is more than enough from me. Let's pass over to the panel, starting with opening remarks, please.
Thanks. And can someone tell me if my sound, everything's okay? I'm switching machines. You can hear me okay now? Lovely, thank you. Meg, thanks for your introduction on that. And you and I have spoken about these things over a number of years, I think now. And so I've got a 5-minute gallop through some of the issues. My sense is that most people support some kind of reform or changes to the House of Lords. I think my first one might be the name of the body. I doesn't think that conjures up some images that are perhaps not very helpful in the way we do, but not least the House of Lords itself, as you've mentioned already about the Burns report set up by Norman Fowler when he was Lord Speaker, looking specifically really at the size of the House and the composition. And most debate around change tends to be on the form, who's in the second chamber, how they get there, rather than what the second chamber does. And I thought the comment you made about often when people engage with the House of Lords and look at the work we do, that's quite an attractive idea to them. They like the way we work, and that goes down well. And it's a shame sometimes that the press we get is so bad. I think the House of Lords conjures up that image of us all wearing these silly robes that we have to wear from time to time. When my big focus would be, what do we want a second chamber to do, and how do you best achieve what the function of a second chamber should be? And I think we need to do a bit more to promote how we work as well. For some people, the very idea of an unelected part of the legislature is a complete anathema, and they want sort of the big reform of a fully elected second chamber. As much as I would love to be called Senator Smith rather than Baroness Smith, it worries me sometimes that again, we focus on the form rather than the function. And I think in any reform and change we look at, how does it improve what we do? And the role we fulfill, I think, about the scrutiny of legislation, the detail, some of the things we've been doing today and yesterday around the police bill, for example, are the kinds of issues that resonate with the public and people want to hear about checks and balances in the system. I think when we're looking, if we're looking at a big reform, I think my starting point on that would be, would we want to still have the limited powers we have at the moment? Would we still want to have this sort of subsidiary role? Jeff Rooker, one of my colleagues in the Lords, always refers to the House of Lords as a subcommittee of the House of Commons, because on any legislation, all we can do is suggest changes to the House of Commons. Would we want that, or would we be happy to build in more conflict into the relationship? I think the areas you've mentioned, Meg, as Chair, are those that were raised in the Burns report, which is about the size and appointments. Yes, the House of Lords has become too large, although I think some of the numbers that are given are never really the true membership, because in terms of how people attend on areas of special expertise. There are numbers that don't attend. So you really would get over 500. That I think is still too large for a second chamber. And the Burns report had some good suggestions of how to look at that and reduce that. What has happened over time is that every new government wants to have some rebalancing of the House, more in its image. But that, I think, has been accelerated in recent years, particularly under the last government. When the Labour government lost office in 2010, the difference in the percentage makeup of the two main political parties was just 4%. There were 4% more Conservative MPs than Labour. Today, that difference is 12% between the government party and the opposition party. And given that the House of Lords should have a scrutiny role, I think that makes that role a bit harder when the government party is more dominant. That has led, I think, in the Burns report to look at suggestions of how you can refresh and retire the membership. And one of the suggestions I quite like of that is that the House of Lords could in some way, the appointments, or I would change the Appointments Commission, the process to some extent, should reflect the House of Commons over several elections. So the authority is derived from the House of Commons, but it doesn't exactly reflect the House of Commons, so wouldn't be directly elected. And that's some of the things that Burns has looked at about people leaving the House and refreshing the membership. The issue of legitimacy, I think, is quite a key one. And there's a number of different views on this. At the moment, the House of Lords, and Michael, I think particularly, Lord Jay will confirm on this, the House of Lords often pulls its punches. There's never been a golden age where government loves the idea that the House of Lords is going to change or suggest changes to its legislation. But I think this government particularly does resent it. And Brexit brought, I think, a particularly toxic element to some of the debate. When Theresa May called the 2017 election, she cited the House of Lords as one of the reasons why. And yet she had no changes to the legislation that she quoted. The House of Commons kept legislation intact, and the House of Lords amendments were rejected. So where we are at the moment, I think the House of Lords itself would like to see change. We particularly like to see change on size and appointments with better balance. We would particularly like to see change, I think, in the by-elections for hereditary peers, where if one hereditary peer departs, then there's a by-election amongst the existing ones that are all men. It must be the smallest and strangest electorate, a bit like Dunny on the Wold from Blackadder. I think we would like to see those come to an end. The House of Lords would stop that. The government won't support it, even though I've promised a fair Windsor legislation, because it says all or nothing legislation. And I think in this country, we tend to go for incremental change. I think the poor public image could be addressed quite significantly if we looked at how we were constituted and we explained our role better. And I think that would help. Because curiously, I think the public like what we do. They like the element of independence and crossbenchers as well. But I do think we need to address the membership and the form of the House of Lords. But the starting point has to be, how can we do what we do better rather than just look at who does it?
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Angela. That gets us off to a really strong start. You were talking there about the Burns report, and I should probably just clarify, my mistake, not yours, that that's the report of the Lord Speaker's Committee on the Size of the House, which was chaired by a crossbench peer called Terry Burns. And of course, they made a set of recommendations and not a lot has happened in terms of controlling the size since. I think that brings us quite nicely to Michael Jay, who used to chair the Appointments Commission, of course doesn't anymore, so he can speak freely, but maybe about whether there are ways in which appointments ought to be more regulated. But I don't want to put words in your mouth, Michael. We'll come to that if that's not in your opening remarks. Do tell us what you wanted to say.
Well, thank you very much, Meg. I will come to that, but I just wanted to start off with a little bit of a broader perspective, because I think it is quite important to see the House of Lords reform in a slightly broader perspective. I mean, in my view, and I very much agree with Angela on this, I think the Lords does perform a necessary function in our constitution by examining and improving legislation and by holding the government to account through debates and select committees. I might say I chair a committee at the moment on the Northern Ireland Protocol, which has 3 members of the House of Commons and 3 members of the Northern Ireland Assembly, 3 members of parties. It has 6 parties on it. But there's no doubt, I think, that the size and the appointments arrangements do bring the House of Lords into disrepute. And I think that's a real pity. I think there is a real contrast between the negative press coverage there often is on appointments and the myriad emails that we all get from campaigning and other groups who are focused on the need for changes in legislation, and who, in my view, rightly do see that the Lords can make a real difference. So I think there does need to be reform. Now, I have to say that if I was starting from scratch, and of course I know we're not starting from scratch, but if I were starting from scratch, I would see advantage in having a House of Lords which reflected what seems to me to be an increasingly federal United Kingdom, with representatives from Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and from the regions and the cities of England. But of course, which regions and which cities, and such an arrangement would in any case set up a conflict with the Commons, which would be representing constituencies, and the Lords, which would be representing regions. So I doubt whether that would be acceptable to the House of Commons, though I'd be interested in Bernard Jenkins' view on that. So I think you fall back on a more realistic option for reform, which is to reduce the size of the Lords and ideally to clean up the appointments process, in my view, by putting the Appointments Commission on a statutory basis. Now, taking that second point first, it's not, of course, HOLAC reform. Reforming the House of Lords Appointments Commission is not straightforward. Putting it on a statutory basis would require primary legislation. That would take time. Appointments to the Appointments Commission would also, I think, have to be made by the House, and it would have to report to the House. You'd need to keep the Appointments Commission small. At the moment, it's, I think, 7 members, and you need to keep it. It seems to me that a 9 is the maximum number of people for a sensible Appointments Commission, so you'd need to keep it small. And also you would need to have the Prime Minister would need to have some room to make ministerial appointments when governments change. It seems to me that one of the things which the House of Lords does actually rather well in our constitution is enable the Prime Minister of the day to make ministerial appointments to fill particular jobs in particular departments that need expert knowledge. I think that's a good thing to do. But as I say, all that would take time, and the government is in any case not keen on a statutory appointments commission. So you do fall back on the ideas which Terry Burns in his report, and in the way in which the number of updates to that report have been produced in the last few years. And what does that mean? I think that means, first of all, you need to set a cap on the size of the House of Lords. The Burns report says 600. I think myself you could do with 400, but let's say it's 600. You then need to set a timetable for reductions, and you need to get the different groups in the House of Lords, the Conservatives, the Lib Dems, the Labour, and the crossbenchers, to agree on a process for restricting numbers. And you also, I think, would need to get people who are appointed to the House of Lords to agree to sign up to a 15 years maximum period of service, with some sort of moral or other sanction if they stayed on beyond 15 years. Now, I think if you were to do that, then you could reduce the size of the House of Lords without primary legislation, which would be a sensible thing to do. But of course, that all does depend on the Prime Minister of the day practicing some relative abstinence as far as appointments are concerned. And that, of course, is a moot point as to whether he or she will. And if I could just answer one point which Angela made, this is my final point about how the House of Lords is seen in particular by the House of Commons. I mean, I think there's no doubt it is at the moment seen as being, certainly the crossbenchers are seen as siding with the Labour Party. But when I joined the House of Commons, the House of Lords in 2006, there was a Labour government, and I have absolutely no doubt at all, and I know, that the House of Lords was then seen as being closet conservatives. So I think that the point of view of certainly as far as the crossbenchers are concerned, they look at legislation, and legislation is often rather bad legislation. And so they'll often vote with the opposition, not because they want particularly to vote with the opposition, but because they want to vote for better legislation. And I think that's a point which both political parties could perhaps reflect on.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I quoted in my book on the House of Lords the view that used to come from the Labour Party that the crossbenchers were, quote, Tories in disguise, and wondered how long it was going to be until they were being accused of being Labour in disguise. And
Yep.
of course, exactly that happened. And that's part of the whole controversial nature of having a second chamber, that it tends to always be at odds with the government, and therefore governments don't like second chambers, even when they're elected, as I've found when looking at other places around the world. Bernard, you come as in Westminster speak from the other end.
Other end of the corridor.
How does it feel in the House of Commons? How does it feel from down there, and what do you think might be feasible? You've long been a supporter of small-scale reform, and it's simply not happening.
Well, I think the House of Lords continues to evolve in character and in attitude, and it's a dynamic institution. So I think to say that nothing changes, its membership continues to transit through from appointment or inheritance, election from the inherited, until death. It's important to remember, I think, that the House of Lords, 823 members, there are very, very few occasions when any but just a reasonable proportion of those members actually attends. And to some extent, the people that attend regularly are self-electing and create the character of the House. And some nights when the government is defeated, I mean, less than half the House is there, which would be a very strange thing to happen in the House of Commons. And one gets the impression that a lot of what happens in the House of Lords is based on the sentiment of the political moment, or about the substance of the political issue, which of course is very different from the House of Commons, where the lines are usually drawn along simply party lines. Interested in some of the questions that have appeared on the chat already. Should members of Parliament who've lost elections be appointed to the House of Lords? But there's another one further down, which just says, can they be appointed on the basis of proven political acumen? Well, I thought a member of Parliament that loses an election and then gets into the House of Lords has demonstrated considerable political acumen by advancing, by recovering their political career. And I think that also underlines something about being in the House of Lords. I can tell you something that's very frustrating at the moment for a lot of Conservative MPs. We're desperately annoyed that the Prime Minister keeps appointing rich donors, very few of whom, ironically, Lord Cruddas is an exception that proves the rule, but very few of whom do very much when they are appointed peers, and very often take leave of absence as soon after they're appointed, because once they realise that actually scrutiny of legislation is very hard work, sitting on committees is very hard work, and just even voting regularly is pretty inconvenient. And so they make one or two speeches and then they're off. And that goes for quite a lot of the ex-MPs. I mean, I think Michael Heseltine only ever turns up in the House of Lords to vote against the government, the Conservative government. He never bothers to come and support the government. And that's been the case for quite a long time, though he's a great man. So just gives you a flavour of the institution, that one of the things about the House of Lords is that people turn up when it's something very important to them, and they feel they've got a particular expertise. So if you have a debate on universities, all the ex-vice chancellors will turn up. If you have a debate about the armed forces, all the ex-armed forces chiefs will turn up, and so on. So in a way, the large size of the House of Lords is an advantage, because you've got this pool of expertise upon which you draw, which would be limited if you reduce the size. Having said that, I think it has outgrown itself, and with the increasing number of kind of professional peers who attend all the time rather than just occasionally, it could be smaller, because it's quite difficult running a house with so many members in it. I would just say this: it seems to me we're all fairly agreed about what we want the House of Lords to do, which is to revise legislation, to scrutinise the executive, and to act as a check on the absolute legislative authority of the House of Commons, to ask the House of Commons to think again. And, and interestingly, unremarked until George Osborne got into trouble with a very controversial regulation, which was fundamentally changing the nature of tax credits. The House of Lords has never usually voted against secondary legislation, which is a kind of rubber stamp exercise. And if the House of Lords votes down secondary legislation, that's it. It's dead. There's no ping pong process. So the House of Lords has got much more power over, but so much of government is done by secondary legislation these days. The House of Lords has got a very powerful position, which it uses very sparingly and with great restraint. But what is perhaps more difficult to agree on is what the House of Lords should not do. I think we all agree that it shouldn't be a duplicate of the House of Commons. I'm sure that most MPs do not want the House of Lords to become so democratically legitimised by some form of election or regional representation that it has a mandate to challenge the authority of the House of Commons. But then we're getting into a bit more difficulty. The adage that I love about House of Lords reform, and which is why House of Lords reform always seems to take so long or not at all, is, as you said at the outset, Meg, there is clearly a majority of people who want to see House of Lords reform. But in the House of Commons, that majority may be very large, but there is no particular majority for any particular reform. And that is where House of Lords reforms always founder. I think I'll just round this off by saying that I think there is a complication about HOLAC, and this is how regulation is straying into politics. And there's always a tension between what a democratically elected politician who is accountable to the elected should be allowed to do, and then what some appointed official or appointed body should be able to stop that politician doing. And it does create a tension, but in the end, one of the safeguards in our constitution, if you like, to prevent the House of Lords going completely rogue, is that the government of the day could appoint more peers in order to get its legislation through. And that is not a new thing. That's, after all, that was how the House of Lords was reformed in 1911, when the then Liberal government threatened to flood the House of Lords with a whole lot of Liberal peers, and indeed did so in order to force through, I think it was a budget in those days or something, I can't remember, but that's how, that's a very traditional thing. And the other thing about cash for peerages, I'm afraid that's a very traditional thing, which we don't like anymore now. Lloyd George, legend, the honours system was a menu with prices under Lloyd George, we're told. We don't like that now. And actually, personally, I think the answer to that is not reform of the House of Lords, it's the reform of party political funding. That if we had a system of party political funding which limited the size of donations that any individual or corporation or body could give to any political party, so you were limited to, say, a donation of a maximum of £100,000, you wouldn't have the problem of the Prime Minister trying to please a few millionaires to fund the Conservative Party. And incidentally, I think Lord Levy and Tony Blair did the same thing. So the kettle is always, the pot is always calling the kettle black in this particular game. So I would reform party political funding rather than try and reform the appointments process to ameliorate some of the problems we've got in party political funding, which actually are probably very much more serious. And thirdly, I fail to understand why the House of Lords, if it's so keen on reducing its own size, it can't organise its procedures in order effectively to reduce its size. Now I'm told, oh, we can't do that. We can't stop somebody attending the House of Lords unless they've got without primary legislation, and I understand that. But there are procedural things that could be done effectively to reduce the size of the House of Lords. But I don't think the peers really want to do that. I think that's part of the problem. I think there's less agreement about House of Lords reform in the House of Lords than some people care to admit. And lastly, I would just say, I think changing the name of the House of Lords is almost the least important thing. Another comment on the chat says, can we look at other systems? Well, you've got a great variety of systems to choose from. You can have an entirely elected upper house, or you could have an entirely appointed upper house, as they do in Canada. They still call it a Senate. I'm afraid there are plenty of examples to choose from, too many to choose from, to give you any instant answers.
Let me fire a few questions at each of you before we open it up. You're reacting to each other, and I want to give you a little bit of a chance to respond to partly to what each other have said. In Angela, there was a strong response from you when Bernard talked about secondary legislation, and I wonder whether you want to say something about that. And no obligation, but it looked like you wanted to say something. And then the last point there, I can imagine you might have something to say about why the House of Lords is shrinking itself. And then I'd like to ask you something else, but responses to some of those things that
those two, yeah, certainly. My original secondary legislation is the House of Lords has just produced 2 reports. One's called Government by Diktat, about the use of secondary legislation. And Bernard's quite right, it is a power we have that's used very, very sparingly, in that the House of Lords can actually vote against secondary legislation in what's called a fatal motion, and that would kill off that secondary piece of legislation. And I think that's been used 5 times since 1945. The tax credits actually wasn't an example. The House refused to give. It suggested the government went back and had to look at mitigating measures rather than rejecting it outright. The government went into sort of full flow apoplexy about that and produced the Strathclyde report that wanted to take that power away from us. So I think it is an unsatisfactory power. You're right, Bernard, and it's observed in the by not using it, on the grounds that it might actually curtail government. But one of the things that is happening more and more, we're seeing more and more skeleton bills where there is the detail is in the legislation, and so much is in secondary legislation, and the consequence is that it's not properly debated. So I think there's a huge issue about the use of secondary legislation in Parliament generally. I see Bernard nodding at me on that one. I hope you've read the reports, they're really fascinating. What was the second one you mentioned, Meg? Asked me about the...
Let me throw in, there's also a very important review going on, run by the Hansard Society, on this question of secondary legislation at the moment, and people who are interested in it should look at their website and maybe... Yeah.
Oh, the other one I think you mentioned was on the numbers of the House.
Yeah, he's not convinced that you actually do want to reduce your numbers. Why don't you just get on with it? I think I know the answers to that, but I'd be interested.
There's 2 or 3 answers. Actually, I'd only been the leader of the Labour group for a few weeks when Jacob Rees-Mogg, who likes to think of himself as a great constitutionalist, which I don't agree, threatened that if the House of Lords didn't pass a certain piece of legislation, would have 1,000 new peers would be introduced into the Lords to force government legislation through. I did have a plan for dealing with that one. I have to say that it wasn't going to happen. I think one of the problems will be is getting a political balance in doing so. And so I think from our side of view, we have been reducing our numbers on the Labour benches. I wouldn't say it's altogether voluntary. More people have left because they've died or through ill health have retired. And our numbers now stand at 160, I think it's 167, as opposed to 258 for the government. So I think you would need agreement with all your parties, but we would certainly be up by saying we could reduce our numbers. Can we have some new people come in because you want to refresh? And that was the point I made earlier about in the Terry Burns' report. One of the things they suggest is the House of Lords, the proportion of the political parties and a proportion identified for crossbenchers reflected what happened in the House of Commons, say over 3 elections. You would have a natural way of exiting people and bringing new people in. And I think I find it just unacceptable. People are there forever, and I think you have to, so they decide to retire, which was an incremental reform. So I think there's an issue there about giving people the opportunity to retire, about leaving and bringing new people in, and having a churn of members can bring in new expertise and fresh expertise whilst not losing the old, but do it in a gradual way, but being there for life. And I don't want to be here when I'm 80. If I am, please invite me back and tell me what I said today.
And that all points to me towards the need for a sort of agreed framework between the parties, which exists across governments as well, which people either agree to to an informal set of rules on balance and so on, or else it actually gets imposed.
It is, and I think, to be honest, Theresa May was probably moving in that direction. The letter Theresa May sent to Norman Fowler after the report was that she would exercise discretion and caution, and that has changed. I saw in the Q&A somebody asked about people who had lost their seats coming in. The interest in the names, they mentioned the names of 3 peers. What I think was interesting there, these were people who had been Labour MPs, but had left the Labour Party and fallen out of the Labour Party and were brought in by the Prime Minister into the House of Lords. So though they were former MPs, they weren't being brought in for their party, they're basically being brought in to oppose their former party. So there's some odd things have happened in recent years. I think there's a role for HOLAC to play, but I think that needs to be identified and changed in its role, not just saying to HOLAC, you identify who they should be. We've had a debate, as Lord Jay mentioned, about having the House of Lords Appointment Commission being statutory. We had that debate in the House of Lords just a few weeks ago, and there is merit in that. I'm not sure the House of Lords Appointment Commission should have the final say, but to offer guidance and the kind of criteria by which would be reasonable for people to make a contribution. Can I pick up on one question that was in the chat though, Meg? Somebody said that said you had to focus on function, not form of the House of Lords. Don't the two go together? Absolutely, the two go together. I wasn't sort of saying one to the exclusion of the other. I was saying too often function is ignored and we only talk about form, and the two go hand in hand. So I'm probably agreeing with the questioner on that one.
Yes, completely. And I feel that I set you up rather badly there at the beginning there by talking too much about form and not enough about function. And you were very rightly started by talking about function, which is always more important. Let me bring Michael in. While we're talking a lot about the sort of the appointments process and regulation and so on, you're obviously in favour of strengthening the Appointments Commission further. You said so. I'd be interested in your view on where the balance party leaders and the Appointments Commission. And it sounded like you wanted it to tilt rather more in the direction of the Appointments Commission, but how much control should the Appointments Commission have over party appointees, do you think? And in particular, what solutions can you see through strengthening that framework to avoid these kind of cash for peerages allegations? Is there more that the Appointments Commission should be doing to sort of test whether people have anything really to contribute to the chamber? Should there be greater limits on donors? How do we do that?
Well, as things are at the moment, of course, the House of Lords Appointments Commission has 2 functions. One is to appoint crossbenchers, and the other is to vet, just for propriety, not for suitability, appointments by the political parties. Now, certainly when I was chair of the House of Lords Appointments Commission, we turned down members of certainly both the 2 members from, or appointments from, the 2 major parties. And in every case that we did that, the Prime Minister of the day accepted that, and the appointments never happened. I think myself, it is a great pity that today's Prime Minister has not followed that precedent, because I think it does weaken the House of Lords Appointments Commission. I think it's important that the House of Lords Appointments Commission is seen as being, as it is, genuinely independent and making genuinely independent and sensible recommendations. So I would hope, if it stays as it now is, that Prime Ministers do accept its appointments and pass them pretty swiftly to the Queen to say yes to them. Could I just make a couple of other points on something which Bernard said? I think that it would be very good if party funding were to be revised so that there was less need for political parties to seek lots of money from peers. But I think there is another possibility which we haven't mentioned, and that is you could appoint people as peers, but who were not members of the House of Lords, i.e. who did not sit in the chamber. So you would have, in a sense, 2 sorts of peers, and those who contributed to party funds, if you are unable to change the present system, could contribute to party funds and be called peers but wouldn't sit in the chamber, and you have another set of peers who would be appointed by the House of Lords Appointments Commission and who would be appointed because they were going to make a real contribution. So you'd overcome the difficulty, which Bernard mentioned, of people making one speech and then disappearing, because they would know that they were there in order to make a proper contribution to the House of Lords. So I think that's one possibility that I'd mention. And I'm afraid I haven't on my iPad got the list of questions coming in, so I'm afraid I can't answer any of those at the moment.
No, it's fine. We'll call Lisa in just a minute to pull some of those out. Although you've already alluded to some of them in what you've said. Bernard, I don't think it was your words. Do feel free to respond to what other people have said, but I don't think it was your words. I think it might have been Angela's words. The idea of practicing abstinence. The Prime Minister practicing.
That was mine. That was mine.
Yeah. I wonder if
relative abstinence, I said.
You've dried up, Meg, so I'll just speak in your absence. Abstinence. Well, Theresa May showed abstinence, but I'm not quite sure why she did and what she was planning, and maybe we'll never know. It would be ironic if, we, in the name of democracy, we denied the legitimate Prime Minister of the day the historic right to appoint a peer, and it was handed over to an appointed body as an absolute. And I think to have some tension between the two, rather than to make an absolute transfer of power, is healthier. I think that the issue around a particular appointment was exposed. I think it was unfortunate for the reputation of the House of Lords and for the Prime Minister, and indeed for the peer concerned. I don't know what the grounds were, but let's be absolutely honest that if you give a lot of money for a political party, it certainly shouldn't be regarded as a disqualification for being a member of the House of Lords. And in fact, as I said, there are one or two donors that are very good. But what is frustrating is there are not nearly enough people appointed to come and do the committee work and do the legislation. And maybe there should be some mechanism so that the MPs in the House of Commons can have more of a say over the choices that are made on their behalf by their parties. Maybe that's something that parties should address internally, rather than it's about the accountability of the leader of the party within the party, rather than a formal constitutional question. There's a new idea. There's one person on the chat who is talking about why can't we have a proportional representation system? Well, just imagine if you had, for good or ill, we have a system of election in the House of Commons that is quite sensitive to changes in opinion in order that it should provide a clear decision at a general election. It is a proportional system. It is less proportional than what some people call proportional representation. There are several systems of proportional representation, and some are more proportional than others anyway. So if we were to have a proportional representation system for the House of Lords, imagine what would happen. The House of Lords would say, well, we are actually more representative of the country as a whole than the House of Commons, which is elected under a different system. And therefore, we have more legitimacy than the House of Lords. Well, you're completely upsetting the Constitution, which is based upon constitutional government, parliamentary government, mainly in the House of Commons, with the House of Lords scrutinizing and revising and acting as an occasional check. You're completely upsetting the system. You're rewriting the whole of the British Constitution. So I don't think that will ever happen in my lifetime.
I have a feeling you're all going to be making Lisa's job as question master rather more difficult by pinching all the best questions out of the chat before he's got to them. I'm sorry, I've turned my video off because I'm having difficulty with the connection, and I managed to drop out even with the video turned off. So I hope I managed to stay with you now. I think maybe we should pass over to Lisa now. I've still got a few questions I'd like to ask you, but let's see what the audience has got, and maybe we can come back to one of my questions at the end if they haven't already been picked up. Lisa, what have you got for us?
Right, I've got plenty of brilliant questions from the audience, and do keep them coming in. We will probably return to one or two that have already been addressed, just so that all of the panel members have their chance to comment on them. But I thought we'd start with two really interesting questions on membership. So the first person to speak will be Alice Smith, who's recently been studying the House of Lords as part of A-level politics. And then we'll move to Eleanor Doughty for a question about the hereditary peers.
Alice.
Hello, I'm 16, and within our Year 12 politics lesson a couple of weeks ago, we analysed how represented the House is. We personally thought, as a group of 16 to 17-year-olds, that we thought the House wasn't representative of the general population. What does the panel think about diversity in the House, and what could be done to see an increase in minority groups, such as Black and ethnic minority people, disabled people, and LGBTQ+ people being seen in the House?
Great question, Alice. Thank you very much. And Eleanor.
I write about hereditary peers for a living, so I accept that I'm coming at this from a slightly weird angle, but I'm curious to know whether within the House there is a consensus that hereditary peers truly bring nothing, and therefore should be permanently excluded. I think of Lord Cruddas often when I'm interviewing people who think that they haven't a place in the Lords anymore. Are their 500-year-old titles any less? Does that make them less useful to the Lords than somebody who has just made lots of money in the city? I don't know. I'm just curious to know what the consensus is within the Lords, and whether people can even identify them as they walk around. It's a curious idea. I mean, I just interview lots of old white men all the time, so perhaps I don't know. Anyway, I've talked a lot there. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. And one of the questions I was going to ask was just to try and seek clarification from the panel about why nothing ever happens on the hereditary peers. So maybe you could scoop that up along with Eleanor's question. What exactly is it that blocks the progress of this little tiny reform that people have been talking about for 20 years? Shall we start with Michael?
Well, thank you. Thank you. I speak as one of the many elderly white men that Eleanor has been talking to over the last little while. But let me address the first question, Alice's question first of all on diversity. I think that's a really interesting point. And when I chaired the House of Lords Appointments Commission, and we had very clear instructions, really, that the terms of reference for the committee was in making appointments to reflect diversity, to reflect the diversity of Britain as a whole. And that meant that we were very conscious of the need to ensure that diversity in its broader sense, whether one's talking about gender diversity or ethnic diversity, was reflected in the appointments. And I think we were appointing 4 or 5 people a year. And when you've got that number to the crossbench, it is possible to reflect diversity reasonably well. When, as now, you are appointing, I think it's about 2 a year, it is very much harder to do so. So I think that the point you make about the need for the House of Lords to reflect diversity is a really important one. It loses its authority even more if it is not seen as being a properly diverse institution. So I would like to see more moves in that direction.
And of course, the Appointments Commission was seeking to do that for its own peers, but this is an example of one of the things which it has no control over at all from the parties. And one possibility that's been mooted by the predecessor committee to the one that Bernard chair, I remember years and years ago, was that the Appointments Commission might require a certain level of diversity amongst appointments coming forward from the parties. I don't know whether you think that's a good idea and whether the other 2 speakers might accept that as a solution.
Well, I do think that's a good idea. I mean, to be honest, I think actually that the parties are quite good in coming forward with appointments and proposed appointments which reflect diversity. I haven't done the maths, But I think one of the difficulties with the crossbenchers at the moment is that appointments tend to be, at least the Prime Minister's appointments tend to be chiefs of the defence staff, cabinet secretaries, permanent secretaries of the Treasury, all of whom have up to now been men. So I think this is an issue which I raised with various cabinet secretaries about the need, when making prime ministerial appointments, to try and make certain that diversity is better represented than it is now by those appointments being made. I have to say that I speak as a permanent undersecretary of the Foreign Office, or a former one, and all of us have been men too.
Angela, would you like to comment on diversity and on the hereditaries and their usefulness and why they're still there?
But it's interesting, the two sort of go hand in hand in a little way, because on the list of those who are eligible for this bizarre election as hereditary peers, they are all white men. And that is one of the sort of objections to it, apart from the principle. Having said that, when hereditary peers are in the House, to be honest, there is no difference. They're all treated exactly the same. And I don't think most members know who is hereditary and who's not. So the idea that the hereditaries contribute nothing, I think Eleanor's right to kick back on that, because it is a nonsense. Many of the hereditary peers, particularly those that come in now, because they choose to, they stand for election, albeit with very small and slightly odd electorates, because they want to play a role in the House. So a lot of them are very, very good. There's government ministers hereditary, the government chief whip is hereditary. Having said that, the principle of it is something I think people find rather difficult. More the principle of these odd elections. Anyone who's ever watched Blackadder and seen the by-election in Dunny-on-the-Wold will get some sense of how we feel about the by-election. Now, Bruce Grocott, one of my colleagues and a former Chief Whip of the House of Lords, former PPS to Tony Blair in government, has put a bill down to end the by-elections, not get rid of the peers that are there, they would convert to life peers, but end the by-elections. And this has overwhelming support in the House of Lords, massive support. But there is a very small number, probably 4, possibly 5 hereditary peers who put down thousands of silly amendments and talk at length to try and talk the bill out to private members' bill. And we've said to the government, look, we'll give you a fair wind. We'll work with you on this and get this bill through, because I think it's one of the things we find quite difficult. So it's not the individuals themselves, Eleanor, but I think the principle of the by-elections. And it's rather odd. I'm appointed, but I'll be somewhere with a peer who may have been elected by 15 people. And in the case of the Labour Party, because we have so few hereditary peers, we have 4. If one dies, 3 people can elect the one who replaces them. It's a nonsense. But that's not to criticise those who take on those roles. I think in terms of diversity, and Michael's absolutely right, I think we need to be more diverse as a House. I think on gender and LGBT, we are doing better than we are on ethnicity. In terms of our Black, Asian, Chinese, Sikh, etc. members, I don't think we present a good picture to the country. I think that is an issue. On age, I take a slightly different view, because the House, I think if people are younger, I would advise them to go to the House of Commons rather than the House of Lords. Because the House of Lords is supposed to bring a certain experience of legislation, our main focus being legislation. And my experience of members who come in younger, I'm at the younger end of the House of Lords membership, but many of those where we have tried to have people come in who are younger, they can't really afford to do it. And people say, oh, it's £300 a day, you haven't got to do anything. Well, if you want to play an active part in the House of Lords, you do quite a lot of work, and Bernard has referenced this already. If you're living outside London, out of that £320 you've got to pay for your accommodation, you're not going to be able to pay any pension contributions, you're paying for your home outside London, you're probably paying £100 a night for a hotel, and it's quite hard for people. So for younger people, unless they've got some independent means or other employment, they often aren't able to play a full role, which is a bit of an issue. But I suspect that younger people might find the political engagement of the House of Commons is a way to go, and the House of Lords tends to be people who have got experience in some areas of life. That doesn't exclude younger people, obviously, but it means they're less likely to see that as a role for themselves than those who are a bit older. I have to say, I think at the older age can be overrepresented, and some of my colleagues may not appreciate this comment, but there comes a point where there are some people, and it's not actually, I've got Alf Dubs and Joan Bakewell, who are both in their 80s and played a huge and positive contribution in the House. So age alone isn't a criteria, but the age profile is getting older. And certainly
Yeah.
on my benches, where I've had very few new peers come in, our age profile is aging, as we don't get new peers refreshing those that leave.
It tells you something about the House of Lords, doesn't it, when you can be at the younger end of the age range despite having been in Parliament for 25 years. Because Angela was a mere child when she was elected to the House of Commons.
Yeah, I was only 12.
Bernard, we should move on. We should move on soon to the next questions. I want to fit some more people in. But what's the view from your end of the corridor regarding getting rid of the hereditary peers? The bill never arrives with you. If it did arrive with you, would it have support?
Well,
do you think?
I think in my party there's very little interest in it. I think the thing that most incenses me about it is the electorate, as you've already indicated. I think it was Baroness Smith who said that they're all men, and sometime in the Middle Ages they decided to stop hereditary peerages moving through the female line, and so you have a very small electorate of men electing men, and that is more anachronistic in my view than the hereditary principle. And in fact, my wife is a peer, I should declare an interest, and she is agitating with some other female colleagues to have a bill to allow female succession in hereditary peerages. So it would be one way of getting more women into the House of Lords, perhaps not a very modern one. But the other thing is, I mean, there are lots of ironies in this. The hereditary peers, when they come in, tend to be at the younger end of the spectrum. So if you get rid of the hereditary peerages, you're going to have to do even more to address the overrepresentation of seniors, shall we call them. The other thing about hereditary peers is they do tend to come in and contribute a very great deal. And the Conservative parties perhaps come over-reliant on active hereditary peers because we've got so many retired politicians who don't do anything. It's another sort of irony of the situation. Well, there are one or two hereditary peers that have been in and out of government. And if you're a minister in the House of Lords, you have to work incredibly hard because you probably represent 2 or 3 government departments. And you have to answer all the questions and do all the debates about all those government departments' portfolios. And it's incredibly hard work. And then because they've got land and they're quite rich, they're told they can't be paid. So, I mean, there's hundreds of anachronisms that one choose to clean up. Incidentally, the £300 a day allowance means that the taxpayer gets incredibly good value out of these incredibly dedicated people who do turn up. And all it does is and have no staff unless they pay for it out of their own allowance. Yeah. It's an extraordinary feat that we send a huge bill up there, like the recent crime and sentencing and policing bill, an enormous bill, very complicated, which our House hardly looks at, and we rely on the House of Lords to look at every line, every section of the bill, and it comes back very substantially changed. And the government itself puts through a whole lot of amendments, which it realises it needs to put through. And the bill arrives back in the House of Commons in a very different shape, but very much improved. I mean, that's let us not forget, for all the problems of the House of Lords, it does work at the moment. It still just about works.
Probably worth mentioning there, Bernard, there's always this talk about a conflict that the House of Commons doesn't like amendments from the House of Lords and chucks them out. Probably about 95% of the amendments suggested in the House of Lords are either accepted by the government, they bring back something similar, or are voted in and stay in the legislation. Yeah. There's occasional flashpoints, as we'll see in the next week or so, but mostly they're accepted as being useful to government.
Yes, and as I've documented in some of my work, there is actually more cross-party agreement that goes on sort of beneath the radar in the House of Lords than most people are aware exists in Parliament, through people suggesting things and the government accepting that they're a decent idea and implementing them. We think of the to and fro and Prime Minister's questions as typical of Parliament, and it absolutely isn't. There's all sorts of other stuff going on, particularly in the
what we particularly dislike in the government backbenches is having to vote down something that's really a popular amendment on the basis that the government says, don't worry, we'll deal with it in the House of Lords. So we get all the, this happened on the issue of sewage dumping in rivers and estuaries. The House of Commons was forced to vote down the amendment to have a much tougher regime on water companies discharging sewage into rivers and estuaries, only for the government then to accept an amendment in the House of Lords. So everybody who had been forced to vote against it, against their better judgment, was then allowed to vote for it. And fury amongst MPs, but
You've
that's
got a lot of flack for it. You might want to have a word with your whips about their tactics there.
Well, I voted. I voted for it for the first time because I knew what was happening.
Let's go back to Lisa because we're crowding out the audience here. Lisa, what else have you got?
Yeah, we've got at least 2 more fantastic rounds of questions here. So let's return back firstly to one which Bernard touched on when speaking, which is what the panel thinks of the adaptation of the bicameral Westminster system in other countries, and particularly the upper houses in Australia, the Australian states, Canada. Might these offer possible models for a reformed House of Lords? And on a slightly similar sort of comparative note, John Cartledge asks, nobody's seriously advocating bicameralism for Holyrood, Stormont or Cardiff Bay. Is there evidence that their legislative output is defective for the want of a second chamber? And if not, could we explain why Westminster is different? So, why do we want a second chamber in Westminster? And finally, we'll go to Roger Daw for a question about the politics of reform.
My question was, is there not a dilemma that the more logical the membership and the more potentially effective the House of Lords becomes, the more resistance there will be from the House of Commons, from both main parties? I'm afraid I'm old enough to remember the Wilson regime in the 60s with proposals from Dick Crossman, which were successfully resisted, both main parties, and the leaders of that were Michael Foot and Enoch Powell.
Thank you, Roger. And in fact, that touches on a thought which I had in my questions, which was whether it isn't in the interests of the government to actually make the House of Lords look ridiculous in order to weaken it. Such allegations have been made several times in terms of the size of the Lords and the quality of some of the appointments made by peers themselves and in some of the newspapers, because of course a powerful House of Lords is awkward for the government. Angela, would you like to start?
Yeah, I think there's a difference between making the House look ridiculous, and I think, in terms of the size and the appointments and how they're made and the imbalance we're getting, there is quite a few in the House of Lords itself that the government doesn't care if we look ridiculous, because it weakens any work we may do. And that, those on the call may recall that bizarre suggestion that the House of Lords alone could be moved up to York and Parliament would stay in London, but the House of Lords chamber would move to York, which I thought completely misunderstood the bicameral nature of how Parliament works. So I think there is part of that, Roger, most definitely. Having said that, I think you can have reforms that don't make life super difficult for the government, but don't increase legitimacy, but make the House of Lords more effective in how it does its job at the moment. My impression is, in talking to colleagues around the House, there's no desire for the House of Lords and members of the House of Lords, even in my own party, to try and wreck government legislation. Our role is a scrutiny role, advisory one, and we want to improve legislation. And also think the government has to play by the rules. Bernard mentioned the police bill. To throw in 20 pages of new amendments to the House of Lords when they haven't been debated by the House of Commons, I think is seeking to undermine the House of Commons, because the only way they can debate them is if the Lords votes for them, and the House of Commons will get probably a couple of hours to vote for them. So I suppose in many ways, members existing aren't arguing for more legitimacy, but we are asking not to look ridiculous. I think that's probably a fair way of putting it. In terms of bicameral systems, you don't have to have a bicameral system at all. But I think if we didn't have a bicameral system, we'd have to change the way the House of Commons works as well, because the two houses are in balance. Sometimes that works better than others, sometimes a bit more imbalance. But if you were to remove one, or indeed make it more legitimate, you would have to change the way the House of Commons operates, because it's impossible when two work together that action on one doesn't influence the other. So I think if you had a bicameral system, you would have to change how a unicameral system. It may be that you would have more committees in the House of Commons, for example, more independence of committees, because you'd have to find a way of having that scrutiny function. The government doesn't just say to the House of Commons, this is the bill, as Bernard said, you must pass this amendment because the government wants it, and then sort it out later. You haven't got a second chance. I was just thinking one of the good things about the way the House of Lords does legislation is it gives government a breathing space sometimes. Sometimes legislation comes to us, it's quite badly drafted. And in the terms of discussion we have in the House of Lords, particularly if the House of Lords has only discussed half the bill and not the full bill, there's an opportunity for the government to really just think and discuss how it wants to do something. So yes, of course you can have a unicameral system, but I think you have to change the workings of the House of Commons to provide for some kind of more effective scrutiny process in the Commons.
Bernard, I'll come to you now, and then to Michael. I somehow suspect that you agree with a lot of what Angela has said there, and it echoes.
I agree with what Angela said.
Would you like to say anything about the comparative lessons? I mean, I think we've already heard from you.
I kind of did that. I kind of did that during my opening remarks on that particular question. Though I would add, I mean, I think it's the Norwegian Storting elects its own second chamber after the election. And I think in Scotland and Wales, they have committees that effectively act as a second chamber. You have to have that revising process in your legislation. I just want to talk about this, whether it's in the interests of prime ministers for the House of Lords to look really, really legitimate. Well, of course not. And one imagines sometimes that there's a little bit of carelessness in the appointments of peers because they really don't care, which I think is really, really sad. Because if the Prime Minister of the day appointed better peers, we'd get better legislation. And I don't know whether I go with the idea of member peers and non-member peers, because I don't know how you control the Prime Minister from creating a profusion of fake peers. In vast numbers, would certainly cheapen the currency very quickly. The price would go down, wouldn't it? But I'm not sure that's really the answer. But the one thing I would say is before we change the British Constitution, you have to be very mindful that every time we change the British Constitution, there are unintended consequences, which nobody ever thought of. I actually opposed the Fixed Term Parliaments Act because I thought it would have unintended consequences, and boy, it did. And now everybody wants to get rid of it. And if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We're very nearly broke in the House of Lords. It's not working brilliantly, but it is still working. So I think that's why there's not terrific urgency to change things right now.
There's a long history, though, isn't there? That was written in the report that we worked on together of the next small urgent thing. Not changing everything at once because of unintended consequences, but maybe looking at the next small urgent thing.
Exactly.
Michael, we haven't brought you in on this round. We're running out of time here. There's the questioner mentioned Canada as well as Australia. And of course, Canada's a distinctly interesting place at the moment. There's been a recent House of Lords Library briefing paper on what's been going on in Canada, because having come from behind us as having an appointed chamber where the Prime Minister had total patronage, they've now moved to a system where everybody is independent and appointed by an appointments commission. I wonder whether you think we could learn anything from that, or any other reflections you have on international experience.
Well, I think the Canada precedent is an interesting one. I was going to. Nobody's mentioned France, but I think it's quite interesting that there is in France an indirectly elected Senate, so it doesn't get in the way of the House of Representatives, but it does represent the regions in the same way. So it's where I started really in saying that if one was starting from scratch, I'd like to see a House of Lords that represented the regions. On the second point that was made, I entirely agree with Angela that if you are going to have a unicameral system, you have to have major reforms in the House of Commons, and I don't really see that is an option. I thought that the last point that was made, is it in the interests of prime ministers to make the House of Lords look ridiculous? Well, there must be a temptation. I mean, I'm probably naive, but I hope that is actually acted on No, Bernard, I'm probably naive, but I hope that isn't acted on. But I think that the answer comes back to something which actually I think all three of us have focused on, that it really is important to focus on what the House of Lords actually does. And that if you focus on what it does in passing legislation and improving legislation and holding the government to account, it really does it performs a useful function in our constitution. And I sometimes wish that more focus was put on that and less on how it was put together.
Yeah, yeah, it certainly is a very peculiar constitutional arrangement where the Prime Minister has so much control over the makeup of a body which is there to scrutinise and government to account. So it does create some dilemmas for Prime Ministers as to how to behave with respect to the House of Lords, and I think some temptations. We're going to have to end it because we said we would end at 7:15, and there's lots more questions out there, lots more things I'd like to ask you. I want to know what Labour wants to do about the House of Lords, on with the sort of informal arrangements that we've got now in perpetuity, but we're going to have to hold another seminar to discuss all that stuff. I think it just falls to me to thank profusely our wonderful panelists, apologise profusely for my appalling internet connection, thank the audience for coming and for all of their great questions, and I'm really sorry we couldn't get to more of them. Let me remind you that this is being recorded. There will be a podcast available on the Constitution, all of the Constitution Unit channels, as well as a video, and we'll let you know when that's available. And finally, just let me plug our next event. This hasn't been advertised yet. It's going to be advertised imminently, but on the 10th of February, lunchtime, if I remember correctly, we've got an event entitled "What Kind of Democracy Do People Want?", which is going to be the first readout from a big survey conducted by the Constitution Unit on its project called Democracy in the UK After Brexit. There are some really interesting results there about what people want in terms of the balance of power in the Constitution, integrity in politics, and all sorts of other things. My colleague who's leading that project, Alan Rennick, will be one of the speakers alongside Paula Surridge and James Johnson, who was Theresa May's pollster, I believe. So that's going to be a very interesting event. Keep an eye on our website if you are interested in attending. But thank you so much, everybody, and I hope to see you at a future event.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.